Let's now come to the impact that the depreciation of the rupee could have on India's macroeconomy, and the fact that in Europe and in the United States, there's so much talk now of the R word, recession. A lot of the people I went to college with think that Europe is already in recession, even if the numbers don't necessarily suggest that. And macroeconomists in the United States are convinced that by October, the US will be in the grip of a recession. So what's your broad reading on the macro outlook of the global economy? And then we'll get into continents individually.
So firstly, this was a good question you asked, which is what is the macro impact of a global recession on the Indian economy. The second question that you asked was the likelihood of a recession itself. And I think there I am convinced that what you said is indeed likely to be correct. We would hope that that is not the case, but both Europe and the US actually will be in a recession. I would say here that I think the United States in particular and Europe could learn a thing or two from India's policy during COVID, because the recession that is going to come about is because of the excessive tightening of monetary policy. We have to keep in mind that the inflation itself has come about because of demand side factors, and I've said this umpteen number of times in various new interviews that not only United States and Europe but other countries as well, except India, only focused on demand side measures. Now what they're trying to do is basically to reduce demand, and in the process they will create a recession. If they focus more on the supply side frictions, which genuinely are biting, they were there because of COVID, but they've actually been exacerbated due to the Ukraine war. If that is worked on, I think the tightening that will be required would be lower, and that might actually avoid a bad recession. And that is why there is a lesson or two that these countries can learn from India, which focuses on both demand side and supply side.
The India story holds
measures.
Which countries in Europe and Northern America could learn from, which could possibly help in tackling some of the supply side issues that concern you?
So as I rightly mentioned, there are two or three things that stood out. First of all, we identified very clearly that the COVID crisis is a supply side crisis as well, and therefore need to work on supply. That's the first point, acknowledging where the problem is, diagnosing it correctly. That's the first thing. Second, once diagnosed that there is a supply side problem, that the incentives need to be provided to companies, like we did with the PLI scheme, for instance, like we did. We did a lot of structural reforms to actually remove supply side frictions. These are two instances of things that the advanced economies can work on, especially on those products where the supply side frictions are significantly biting. Now let me come back to the first question and the good question that you asked, which was about the macro impact on India. I think I look at it actually in two ways. Firstly, in a global economy that is going to be in recession, India growing at 6.5–7%, I think presents an enormous opportunity, a wonderful opportunity for foreign investors. That's the first thing. And I actually had put out a tweet last week as well that rather than clubbing all emerging countries together, foreign investors should separate India from the other emerging economies which are facing much higher inflation. Turkey at 70–80%, Argentina 60%, and look at the return that India will provide with a 6.5–7% growth when the entire global economy is going to be in a recession. Second point I think which is important, and here I'm going to, rather than talk in the air, I think it's very useful to analyze what is GDP growth comprised of. It's comprised of consumption, investment, net exports, and government spending. If you look at consumption, a lot of our consumption is actually, if you leave out the oil part, it's actually domestic, and I think that would not be impacted as much, from the global recession. If you look at investment, and a large part of investment is being done by the fisc, infrastructure spending, and some of the multiplier effects that I had been actually talking about, are, I think, waiting to come back. If you look at the numbers for May, clearly investment seems to be picking up. So investment, I think, would do well. government spending is endogenous, or that's something that the government chooses, and it is actually choosing to do on infrastructure, which will have its positive multiplier effects. It's only exports that actually might get impacted. Imports, the import bill will increase because of changes in the exchange rate and possible on the impact on the crude price itself. I think there could be some good news on the crude front. If demand goes down, then global crude price actually could come down, but exchange rate may actually be a concern there. Exports, I think, may be impacted, but overall I think we seem to be picking up momentum there. So net, if you put it all together, rather than talk in the air, analyze it carefully like this, the impact on the Indian economy may not be very large, and I think the opportunity that stands out, 6.5–7% growth amidst a global economy in recession, is what I think will really be outstanding.
Do you have any specific policy measure which you'd like to suggest to ensure that India is able to withstand the impact of these global recessionary winds that are blowing at this moment to the extent possible, over and beyond what the government and the RBI are already doing?
So I think, first up, and this is something that I'd actually mentioned even when I was in office, we have to sit tight, actually, grit our teeth a little bit, because this is, a period where there will be capital, there may be capital flight because of the flight to safety, but I think the opportunity that India, really provides will definitely get this capital back. So I think rather than doing any sort of knee-jerk measures on capital, etc., we should basically brave this this phase out. That is first point number one. In other words, don't do any knee-jerk reactions on capital flows, etc. That's point number one. Second, I think redouble on some of the structural reforms that we've been implementing, some of the steps that had been announced. For instance, the labor laws, which the bill got passed. I think that it will be very useful to have the rules implemented, the subordinate legislation, and similarly on the disinvestment. Many of the reforms actually, which are supply side measures, will really help in this process. I think the central bank has already taken some measures, in the to sort of avoid any short-term volatility. But I think the key point I will mention, and as citizens, it behooves us to actually strengthen our policy makers as well by not really focusing on the level of the exchange rate. It is really the volatility that matters.
You're divorcing. You're seeking to divorce economics like from politics. Which is easy for a chief economic advisor to say, but ultimately proves to be very difficult. We're seeing a lot of moves towards trying to encourage trade in non-dollar currencies. The Indian government is pushing it, other central banks are pushing it as well.